Ok.
Good afternoon. I'm Celia Korn, CEO of Korn Traduções and Vice President of BLIS, the Brazilian Language Industry Association. We are very pleased to welcome all of you for today's BLIS webinar. BLIS is the first association of language companies in Brazil, and our goal is to promote our industry both domestically and abroad, and to enhance the Brazilian market representation by increasing the number of member companies. We started with 8 member companies, and in 2 years, we almost doubled that number and going up. Currently, our members are, Tati, could you please, I already said a little bit about, please, next slide, please. All right, so our current members are Korn Traduções, Inside, Braslate, Transmaster, Lockhouse, Aliança, WordLink, Roundtable Studio, Varendi, Follow Up, Trace-On, BTS, Zaum, and Thought Translations. Now I'm going to introduce Dr. Arle Lommel, a senior analyst of CSA, Common Sense Advisory, an independent market research firm. Arle is a recognized expert in the fields of localization and translation, with emphasis on technology and standardization. He holds a BA in linguistics and MA and PhD in folklore studies. I'm going to ask you to please use your chat tool to send your questions that will be answered at the end of the presentation. Now, without further ado, Dr. Lommel, please take the floor.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I can, let me share my screen. Okay, good afternoon and greetings from Indiana in the United States. I have to apologize that I can't address you in Portuguese. Unfortunately, this industry, perhaps ironically, often runs on English, and I have never learned Portuguese, although my wife speaks Portuguese. I hope that my remarks today will be clear for you and useful, and I'm grateful for the chance to speak to you. As a note, please do submit your questions via Zoom, and I hope to be able to answer them at the end. Today, I'm going to be addressing the 6 items you see on screen. First, I'm going to start with the fear that many linguists currently have based on recent developments in artificial intelligence. Second, I'll try to give you a greater understanding of what generative AI actually is versus what you may get from press coverage. Third, I'll shift to talking about what Gen AI does. That's short for generative AI, Gen AI. We'll talk about what it does very well in translation, and then we'll talk about where it falls short. And then fifth, I'm going to spend some time talking about other uses of generative AI that you may want to explore where we actually think it has more potential than in translation. And then I'll close with just some finishing thoughts. Just a few quick words about CSA Research in case you don't know us. CSA Research is turning 20 this year. It's our 20th birthday. We're an independent market research company that focuses on the 5 audiences shown on screen. At CSA Research, our analysts independently develop and conduct all of our qualitative and quantitative studies, and we spend a lot of time and resources to assure that we have representative samples and that we have good quality data. Also, we can provide the best data to the public and to our clients as to what is going on in the language industry. And I won't say more about us than that. If you're interested, feel free to learn more, feel free to reach out to me. But let's start today by discussing the fears that many in the language industry face. What is it about artificial intelligence, and in particular generative artificial intelligence, that creates concerns? As we start, ask yourself what you know about artificial intelligence, and then ask yourself, where do you know it from? If you learned about it from the technology press, you may have some misconceptions about artificial intelligence that can contribute to worries. But what are your concerns? If I don't answer them in this presentation, please make sure to ask about them during the question and answer period at the end of this session. As I mentioned, the tech press has not always been the best source to learn about artificial intelligence. Based on recent coverage that predicts up to 300 million jobs are at risk due to the emergence of generative AI, you may wonder what the future holds for you. Is your job one that is at risk for automation? Will language services be around in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years from now? Would you recommend that young people go into language services, or would you tell them there's no future in this field? When the tech press predicts that translators are going the way of dinosaurs, it's easy to see why many language professionals are worried. Even if these articles use statements like, GPT-4 can easily and instantly transcribe a piece of content into multiple languages, that show very little awareness of what translators do and what AI actually does. In other words, has the Grim Reaper come for language services? Will the machines finally replace translators, interpreters, and other language specialists? Or is your fate a little more complex and a little more open? What should you expect going forward? If you have concerns in this area, you're not alone. We recently surveyed freelance linguists in April, and we found that most freelance linguists are concerned about generative artificial intelligence at multiple levels. When we surveyed them, they had negative to strongly negative views about most aspects of the technology. And their concerns largely reflect reporting on the subject, with data security and copyright issues seen as particularly problematic. Although these issues might not affect linguists directly, they would keep them from using generative AI for client work. However, as we move down the issues listed towards those that directly affect linguists' work, rather than abstract concerns or worries about their clients, their perceptions shift. If we take another view on this same data, where we see what the average view is, we see that their perception, that is freelance linguist perception, is slightly positive for 2 areas: the potential for generative AI compared to traditional MT, and as a tool to help with non-language tasks in their practice. I would argue that these results actually show a good deal of savviness on the part of freelance linguists. For the most part, I would actually rank my concerns similarly to these, although I would be more positive than these figures indicate. The only reason concern I think is really misplaced is that about copyright issues, but this is another issue that can be blamed on press coverage that does not understand what generative AI is or how it works. Now, with that, let's actually look at what generative AI is and how it works. It's my hope that having a little bit of knowledge about this will help you assess claims and be more critical of them. And I would encourage you to be equally critical with my statements as well. If you disagree with me, please say so in the comments or ask me questions. I would rather have you challenge statements so that we can all learn together. Let's first define what we mean by artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, very broadly, is the use of computing technology to imitate human cognition and decision-making. Speaking broadly, any attempt to use a computer to do what humans do with algorithms that act without direct human control can be thought of as AI. And when we think of this, we realize AI is all around us. Think of using a GPS in an automobile, and it gives you a route where nobody has said, here's the route to take, but instead it makes that for you. AI has been around for about 70 years, and in some ways it actually came out of what today we would call the language industry. One of the earliest AI projects was one between Georgetown University in the United States and IBM to translate automatically between Russian and English. This started already in 1954, and it was the first example of machine translation. Now, its success was very limited, but it marked the start of continuous effort to model human behaviors using computers. Also, keep in mind that what is considered artificial intelligence is constantly changing. Things that were considered AI 20 years ago are considered software today. For example, expert systems. These are computer systems that have hard-coded rules to imitate how experts make decisions, were popular starting in the 1970s through the 1990s, but today they're no longer considered AI by many researchers. Instead, they are seen as simple procedural logic as opposed to AI that is based on human cognition. If we turn to the current generation of AI, we're usually talking about generative AI or Gen AI. Although many people associate generative AI with ChatGPT, it is a much broader class of technologies that produce content of various sorts, ranging from images. Here I asked the system to create images of Vikings singing heavy metal, to text. In this case, it's an explanation of gravity, to audio, which I don't have a sample of, to video. Because these are generative, that means they're creating new things, not copying existing content. It may be similar to what's been seen before, but it's generated at the moment it's requested. And the results range from very good to, sadly, positively horrifying, as you may see with this viral video that was made of Gen AI videos that were supposed to depict the American actor Will Smith eating spaghetti and not getting it quite right. This is technology that is able to create new, never-before-seen content based on predictions from existing content. In the example of the Vikings playing heavy metal, the system is trained on images that include images of Vikings and images of heavy metal singers, and it's able to combine characteristics of these images to create new ones that have never been seen, but which show similarity to the training data. This point is crucial to understand. Gen AI is not returning images or texts from a database, but is instead creating them. Very often, articles treat Gen AI as though it's a poor student stealing answers from sources without citing them. But in fact, it's more like a not terribly bright student who has read a lot of articles that he or she does not fully understand and who is now writing a term paper for a university class. This student will make mistakes due to lack of understanding, but isn't simply copying things. With that, let's look at some other common misconceptions that I often see from sources that should know better. First, I see a lot of statements that indicate that Gen AI is an artificial general intelligence, AGI, or artificial superintelligence, ASI. These terms largely come from science fiction and refer to computer programs that achieve human or superhuman intelligence across multiple fields, granting them intelligence beyond human levels. It can be tempting to think that this is an ASI or AGI when you ask ChatGPT about almost anything, and it gives reasonable sounding answers. ASIs are a staple of science fiction with characters like the Terminator and Skynet, often seen as evil figures bent on destroying reality or destroying humanity. But the reality is that Gen AI is not a superintelligence. As I mentioned before, it's a tool that creates new content based on previous content, but often with telltale signs that it doesn't actually understand anything it's saying. A second misconception is that Gen AI functions like a super version of Google, simply retrieving content that's on the web and telling you what it says. Although Gen AI is trained on vast amounts of content, it doesn't store that content, but instead stores properties of it in a mathematical representation. So it doesn't have access to the original training data, but instead to a pre-compiled neural network that represents that data. And this leads to a third misconception, that Gen AI thinks just like humans. I've actually seen this claim made repeatedly, including by language industry sources that really should know better. But it isn't true for a few reasons. First, we don't actually know how humans think with enough detail to assert that any process works like they do. There are some similarities, but there are also profound differences. Instead, Gen AI is a tool for predicting the likelihood of sequences of words, pixels, sounds, or any other digital item. It is best thought of as being like a sophisticated autocomplete function rather than a thinking machine. It is making complex statistical predictions based on millions and millions of examples of content. It's also so important to understand a few common myths that you may encounter in the tech press, and consider them before we move on to look at language industry. The first of these myths is that generative AI hallucinates. You've probably seen this term because there's bad content on the internet. You've probably heard the term hallucination thrown around a lot. So let's talk about what it means. When you see this term in the general press, it usually means that Gen AI produces something that is seen as false or not corresponding to reality. We think of things like this image from Stable Diffusion, which was supposed to show Bob Ross, a famous television painter in the US, making a painting, but instead shows malformed hands coming out of a painting and a brush here that somehow is holding another brush and making the painting. The term comes from the resemblance of output like this to something seen in a hallucination of a human. But over time, it's come simply to mean that the engine gets something wrong. The challenge now is that this broader understanding means that we do not have a clear boundary between hallucination and proper function. To the extent that engines are supposed to be creative and go beyond their training data, we're asking them to do something that is not readily distinguishable from hallucination. In other words, hallucination isn't a distinct category, but it's a value judgment we put on these systems. But from the perspective of the systems, it always makes sense. The second myth, and some people will argue with this, but I'll say that the second myth is that generative AI is committing copyright violation on a massive scale. This is based on the assumption that applications simply paste together bits and pieces taken from training data. But as I've said earlier, the fact is a little more complicated. Gen AI tools don't index content and retrieve it. They create new content that may resemble existing content. So if you think of a Gen AI made painting, it will have a signature on it, not because it's copying someone's signature, but because the training data says there should be a signature in the corner and that humans put signatures there. But if you look closely, you'll see that the signature is nonsense and shows that the AI doesn't understand what a signature is. Now, I do have to add, I'm not a lawyer, so take any of my judgments not as a technical opinion, not as a legal opinion. The third myth is one that's more debatable. And I have a definite perspective on this, and it really gets at the heart of what we're talking about today. It's the myth that Gen AI is ready to replace whatever profession it may be as a profession. So far, however, professionals are finding ways to use Gen AI to be more efficient rather than being replaced. Now, will Gen AI replace some jobs? I'd be naive if I didn't say that almost certainly it's going to replace jobs. But professionals who figure out how to use it can increase their value and find new jobs that didn't previously exist. So with that, let's take a look now at what Gen AI actually can do in terms of translation. And this is an area where many writers claim linguists need to fear. Do they actually need to? Can Gen AI replace human translators? I'm going to argue that it can't, but let's look at what it actually can do. The first thing you need to know is that Gen AI systems were not designed for translation. This capability emerged as something of a surprise to developers and only came about because the training data has so much data in other languages in it. Most of the development today of Gen AI is actually focused on English only or on a handful of languages like Chinese and German. Since translation wasn't planned for, it's really an amazing capability that these systems can translate at all. However, most of them can't. In our tests, only a few actually can. Others may do so occasionally or inconsistently. So most of what I share today is based on use of ChatGPT and GPT-4. And what we find with careful examination is that Gen AI is very good at a few things where neural MT is not done so well. And I just have to note as an aside how strange it is to talk to you about neural MT as though it's something old, given that just 8 years ago, we hadn't even heard of it. And it's still very much an active state-of-the-art field. And I actually think it will continue to be. It isn't going away. But we truly live in interesting and amazing times. The first strength I want to note now, looking at what GenAI does, is that it can imitate styles in translation very well. For example, in the exchange that you see on screen, I asked GPT-4 to translate a bureaucratic text into German, and it followed the style of the source very well. But when I asked it to retranslate it using informal language, it switched to the grammatical informal and used a slang term for a mobile telephone that would not normally be in an official text. Similarly, in another case, I asked the system to translate a text into German that had several terms that have genders in German, just like in Portuguese. In the initial translation, it assumed that a doctor was masculine, it assumed that a nurse was feminine, and it assumed that a teacher was male. But then I asked it to use gender-inclusive language, and it correctly changed the forms to reflect how German handles this task. Now, the result wasn't perfect, but it was a credible attempt that a human linguist could easily make sound better. These are examples of the kinds of tasks that human linguists often are asked to do and that they don't like to do because they take a lot of time, they're kind of boring and tedious, and they don't offer much value. Imagine if you were asked to make these kinds of corrections all day, how little you'd like to do them, and you can start to see where maybe AI has some potential. This can also be extended to organizational style. In this example, I had GPT-4 translate a text from German into English, and the first translation was reasonable, but when I asked it to translate it like Microsoft, it added a few additional words characteristic of Microsoft. The really interesting change when I came about when I asked it to translate it in the style of Apple, and it added Apple-style marketing language that was nowhere evident in the source, such as saying that something had a beautifully designed interface and that it was enhancing overall performance and user experience. Now, incidentally, neither of those phrases are true about the subject, which is about low-level programming and computer, but they do sound like Apple. This capability is something that translators may struggle with if they don't already know the style of a particular company. But if a system can do this, it can give translators better suggestions that are easier to incorporate and use in creating a professional output. GenAI also does a good job at adapting texts for different audiences. In this example, I had a Hungarian text that was written at a university level and used a lot of technical text. Now, don't worry, I don't expect you to read or understand Hungarian. It's a language I happen to speak. But I asked GPT-4 to translate this into English, and it gave a reasonably good translation of this text, which deals with a musical instrument called a theremin. It actually matches the Hungarian quite closely. It's not the most exciting text, but it does capture it. But then I asked it to translate it for 8th graders who are typically 13 to 14 years old. Here, it simplified the text and made it more exciting. Actually, if anything, it reminds me of what an adult might think would appeal to an 8th grader, but would actually probably annoy a teenager who would say, "You're trying too hard, this isn't cool." But it's still making an adjustment. If further I specify that it's for 3rd graders, it shortens the text and uses statements with lots of exclamation points to get kids excited. And it somehow captures what is at the heart of this text while losing a lot of detail. And all this working from an English source to do a kind of transcreation on the fly. GenAI also has a distinct advantage over most MT in that it can look at multiple sentences simultaneously. To see why this is important, consider this example from Google Translate, where it assumes that teachers are masculine, even if they refer to female teachers. In the top row, teacher refers to Mr. Smith and is correctly put in a masculine form, Lehrer. But if we change the text to refer to Mrs. Smith, it should switch teacher to the feminine form Lehrerin, but it leaves it in the masculine. This happens because Google Translate can only look at one sentence at a time, and it uses the masculine form regardless of context. By contrast, in ChatGPT, the system gets both of these right because it can see that the likely referent of teacher in each case is either Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith, and it just makes the right choice. This was a deliberately difficult test because I put the name of the person teacher referred to after the occurrence of teacher. Now imagine if you've been asked to edit MT, how much easier it would be if you were not asked to fix these kinds of mistakes over and over again, but instead could deal with MT output that got these things correct. Gen AI can also do well with languages that have less data. Here I've taken another deliberately difficult example where I use some 16th century Hungarian in period orthography. This is something that modern Hungarians would struggle to read without special training. I translated this myself into English as shown on screen. It's an old-fashioned sounding translation from an author who's worried that people are going to not like his work. Now, just for this audience, I took my English translation and ran it through Google Translate to have it in Portuguese. I have no idea if that's a good translation or not, but it gives you an idea of what it says. Now, when I translated it from this old Hungarian using Google Translate, it actually did pretty well, but made some serious translation errors. You can tell what it's about, but there's nothing in the source about a national interest or about denying anything, or Hungarian nationals is kind of a bit off. When I ran it through ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo, it did better than Google Translate. It's still not perfect, but it's getting closer. GPT-4 actually did a little worse, adding in something about praising the work that's not in the source. That it did this highlights one of the problems with Gen AI that we're going to come back to, which is inconsistency. But either way, it's incredible that any of these systems can translate something like 16th century Hungarian, which is almost certainly not represented strongly in training data. These results would be useful for editing, although not for publication without review. Now, finally, if I updated the Hungarian to use modern orthography, GPT-4 gave a fantastic translation. Perhaps not stylistically perfect, but it nails the meaning exactly. Now, one more strength I want to mention is that you can use prompt engineering. That is the use of instructions within prompts to implement terminology. In this example, I took a nonsense instruction to translate two technical abbreviations as John and Bob, respectively. And the system actually honored that request, even though it made no sense at all. In CSA Research's examination, freelance linguists and LSPs reported their #1 complaint with machine translation is that it doesn't honor terminology. So that you can do this is impressive. But note that current tools are not set up to do this outside of prompt engineering, so you can't expect this to work today outside of demonstrations like this. Without that out of the way, let's now turn to some of the weaknesses of MT. As I go through these, consider what they may mean for you in the future of the industry. One of the biggest challenges right now is that Gen AI applications don't readily connect with TMS or CAT tools. Many of them now have the ability to connect via API, which would seem like it solves the problem, but does it really? TMSs and CAT tools are designed around a technology perspective from the late 1990s that assumes you can carve up translations into individual bits and pieces and translate them and treat them one at a time. If you use this approach with Gen AI, you lose almost all of the advantages I just discussed, and it becomes kind of a dumb MT system. Really integrating Gen AI with TMS and CAT tools will require a rethinking of data structures and approaches. I hope this will result in new and improved TMSs, but it's going to take time. So keep in mind that most of the advantages I previously discussed also require careful crafting of prompts, not merely sending text out for translation. And translation tools just aren't set up for this. We're starting to see the first tools that do this, but it's still not ready for large volumes. The second weakness we see is speed. Today, MT developers generally want something that can return a result in under 1/4 of a second or 250 milliseconds. If it comes back that fast, it seems like it's instant. But ChatGPT, the standard one you use on the web, returns about 10 words per second, which means that a typical translation could take 1 to 3 seconds, which is hardly seen as instant. And if you use GPT-4, sometimes it returns results as slow as 1 word per second. which means that you might wait 15 to 20 seconds for an answer. Now, it's not clear that these systems can actually do much faster. They're already ruthlessly optimized. But it's even worse than this makes it sound, because if you want the advantages I talked about, you need to transmit more than one sentence at a time, and it will translate them in sequence rather than in parallel. So something that might take only half a second with Google Translate could take 4 to 5 minutes with GPT-4. And sometimes it just stops in the middle and doesn't finish something either. So if you don't happen to notice that, you may be missing something you need. A third weakness is that many of the content policies enforced are dominated by English. This screenshot arose when I was using GPT-4 to create those Hungarian to English translations. And one of the texts I was translating was completely inoffensive, but I kept getting this error. I finally tracked it down to a single word in Hungarian, a relative pronoun that happened to start with the same 4 letters as an English ethnic slur. It was clear that these filters and safeguards assumed I was doing everything in English, and so it wouldn't process my request. Will a system be truly usable if it may fail at random times or refuse to translate content into your language because it doesn't know about it and it assumes that everything's in English? Fourth, Gen AI has a pricing problem. The numbers I'll present to you are approximations. It's a bit difficult to compare costs across different systems due to different ways they calculate it, but we made an estimate that Google Translate costs about $120 to translate 1 million words. This is a tiny fraction of the cost of human translation, which might cost 800 times as much. If we use ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo, it's actually much lower, about 1/40th of the cost, at around $3 per million words. This sounds great, but we'll see limits in a moment. However, ChatGPT-4 using the so-called 8K model is anywhere from 1 to 4 times the cost of Google Translate, depending on the languages involved. And if you have to retransmit content or use prompt engineering, it can even be 20, 30 times more expensive. And GPT-4 32K, which allows for even bigger prompts, is double that cost. We actually worry that these are not going to be sustainable because these costs relate to energy consumption and processor power. In the case of GPT-4, this means there's strict limits on the amount of requests you can make in any given time. Now, it may seem like you say, well, why would I submit 20 requests per minute? But an LSP working on multiple projects could easily exceed this, especially if multiple translators are working on a project. In such cases, the tool may not be usable or may force workers to wait rather than helping them be more efficient. And this is done, by the way, because these systems, GPT-4 actually loses money right now. And so they restrict usage to keep from losing too much money. The next challenge is that Gen AI can be highly inconsistent over time. Now, I didn't have a good translation example here, but the screenshot shows where I regularly ask these systems about the Lommel hypothesis, which sounds like a good scientific hypothesis, but it doesn't exist. And quite correctly, sometimes it will try and explain it. Here it gives an explanation for this non-existing scientific principle, but other times it will tell me that it doesn't exist. And the newest version even can point to a LinkedIn article I wrote about how it doesn't exist and say, Arle Lommel says it doesn't exist. In other words, you never know what you're going to get with Gen AI, and this creates a major trust problem. And this leads to one of the biggest problems with Gen AI. I've already mentioned hallucination, but I'm going to give an example of how big a problem this is. Just in the past few days here in the US, a lawyer got in trouble for using ChatGPT to write a legal filing. That legal filing included citations to non-existent court cases made up by ChatGPT. When he asked ChatGPT if the court cases were real, it told him that they were, but in fact, they'd been created out of nothing. And he submitted this and got in a lot of trouble with the court. Maybe if he'd attended my presentation, he would have known that he couldn't trust Gen AI because it makes things up and it isn't a search engine. But he was not aware of this, and so he ended up in trouble. This sort of thing is often called a hallucination, but this points to a problem we'll see. For example, we asked GPT-4 which languages it could translate, and it gave us a long list of about 160 languages. And it included a language from the northwest of Russia related to Finnish called Komi-Permiak. After some searching, we found a text in this language. It's a well-known verse from the Bible. Now, I'm not trying to spread religion here or anything, but it was the one text we could find. Here's the English equivalent, and here's the Portuguese equivalent. This is a very famous passage. Now, when we asked ChatGPT-4 to translate it, it came up with this: catching fish, hook, line, sinker, float, net, trap, ice fishing, spear fishing, and many other methods or ways. These are common methods of fishing. Well, you can see the only thing that it got that was even remotely similar to what it should be was that it had a list of things. This is really an example of the kind of thing that we have to watch out for with generative AI, particularly in languages where there isn't as much data. And almost half of all data in these systems comes from English. 90% of it comes from just 19 languages. Brazilian Portuguese is among them, but Brazilian Portuguese doesn't have a lot of data. So most poor translations won't be this bad, but the fact that Gen AI produces such output without warning shows why there is a big trust problem with it and why it cannot be used to replace humans. Let's say it gets 95% of things right, but 5% is like this, you couldn't trust it. Now, as I round out this section, I do need to mention that MT developers are not ignoring generative AI. They're already working on systems that combine the best of both worlds, using smaller, better-tuned models that look at more than one sentence at a time. And remember that Neural MT is using the same fundamental technology as generative AI. So we can expect that Neural MT is going to get much better. Now, with that, I think I've probably shown you why I don't believe that Gen AI is ready to replace human translators or existing machine translation systems, and why, at least for now, I don't think you need to worry. But let's look at some areas where you may be able to use Gen AI to your advantage. Now, you may recall from this slide earlier that freelance linguists very narrowly saw Gen AI as a good use for non-language tasks. And here CSA Research agrees. We've published reports on all the things that you can do with generative AI to improve your business operations. So let's look at some of these ways. Let's start with sales and marketing. Now, some of these won't apply to freelance linguists, but they all will apply to LSPs, and they'll give you some good ideas of where to apply it. First, we've had very good success in using ChatGPT and GPT-4 to answer questions about buyers. For example, you can ask the system to tell you about the concerns that localization managers in the pharmaceutical industry face, or what the top concerns are for language operations in the insurance industry. When you do this, keep asking questions to refine the answers, and you'll get often very good insights. And they're good enough that they can save you many hours of work. Second, you can use similar queries to create buyer personas. Here you'll want to ask use what is called chain of thought prompting, where you ask questions and then ask additional ones to refine the answers or get different ones. For example, if ChatGPT tells you that a particular buyer persona is likely to have a degree in engineering, you can then ask for more details about what that background or what sort of things that person would do on a daily basis. And then you can use that to create targeted marketing copy for that persona. We found that these tools can do a good job of generating first drafts of blog posts, web pages, and tweets. You'll want to take them and edit them to your own style, but often they'll bring up ideas you hadn't thought of. Think of these tools as being like an eager and excited intern. Sorry, I don't know what the word for that is in Portuguese, but a student who helps, who will have some bad ideas, but who can save you time by creating things you can edit. One area where both LSPs and freelancers can really benefit is in using generative AI to help generate customer-facing emails. Our research shows that most language professionals actually do a very poor job in writing sales emails, often focusing on their internal processes rather than what their prospects need. But if you've created a persona for a buyer, you can then tell ChatGPT to write a short email about how we can help this person with their pain points, and it will generate something that addresses those. This is actually particularly useful for many of you if you need to write questions in English or write emails in English, because this is often something that, if you're not writing in your native language, takes some time. And so you can use this to give yourself a boost. And last but not least, you can use GenAI to help you craft responses to objections from prospects or clients. By helping you focus on what they need, it will enable you to address them more effectively. This can be a big help since you may otherwise focus on your process, which they don't care about, rather than telling them how you can help them with what they need to do. Now, as you work on these, remember always to pay attention to the prompts you use. Save ones that have worked well so you can use them later and modify them. And always check any facts that GenAI returns, since hallucination is a constant risk. Now, I have a few other ones I'm not going to go in as much detail for, but you can use GenAI to do term extraction. It does a fairly decent job, about on par with commercial term extraction tools. A lot of noise, but that's normal. You can also use it to suggest alternative words and phrases. Think of it as being like a good thesaurus. It's quite good at identifying the language that content is in. We've used prompts to set up ChatGPT to do translation quality evaluation. This is a bit mixed. So I wouldn't trust this entirely, but often it can identify clearly bad translations, even if it miscategorizes some good ones as well. And there are people working on this trying to do improvements, so I hope that this will end up better. Another area you can use it is to do research on a new vertical. ChatGPT can help you quickly identify basic concepts and answer specific questions about them. For example, many years ago, I had to translate a text about how piano keyboards function, and a passage of about 5 sentences took me about 4 hours to translate because I had to research so much for it. I recently recreated that task using ChatGPT, and it took about 10 minutes. So it is a huge time saver for doing research. If you're an LSP, you can use ChatGPT to come up with ideas for go-to-market strategies or for new services or offerings. Take your ideas and ask the system for feedback. This is closely related to generating ideas and getting feedback on them. Most of the ideas and much of the feedback may not be what you want, but some of it may help fill in gaps in your thinking. On a more operational side, you can give these tools a lot of plain text, such as from emails, and ask GenAI to summarize it and cluster the information. This can help you eliminate a time-consuming task that may arise when you do client satisfaction surveys and similar tasks. And it can also help you with analyzing customer feedback. If you work in Excel or write code, you can use the tool to help you improve your formulas in Excel or your coding. For basic tasks, it's pretty good. For more obscure topics, the results may be more variable. But I have used it to help debug code that I've written. And finally, you can use it to create job ads and prepare interview questions for candidates. Ultimately, your imagination is the only limitation you face. Well, there's probably technical limitations as well, but so far we're finding that often it's a matter of finding the right way to ask something. So if you think of something where you believe that GenAI could help you out, experiment it and try. Now let's move on to our conclusion. Should you fear the MT Reaper? The AI Reaper, not MT Reaper. I've had to talk about AI, MT, and fears about it so long, it's easy to slip back into that. I hope I've convinced you that GenAI can be useful, but that it is not something that can replace human expertise and knowledge, and that you don't need to fear it. That doesn't mean that you don't need to be cautious and do due diligence, but you don't need to really worry. Okay. Keep in mind that we've been here before. Every new generation of automation or AI leads to projections that the world's ending. For instance, think about accountants. In 1980, accountants were mostly bookkeepers who did basic arithmetic to track where companies had been at some point in the past. They kept large ledger sheets and used calculators to manually track things. Then in 1985, a program called Excel came out, and suddenly most of that went away. Later on, dedicated accounting packages came out, and even more went away, but accountants never disappeared. Instead, they shifted their work to tasks that offer more value, and they found that they actually make better wages today, and they have more specialties. Will linguists be able to do the same? This remains to be determined, but I'm optimistic that automation of low-value translation that doesn't need human attention will increase the overall cost effectiveness of translation and boost the top end of the market where humans are needed. Now, admittedly, this could change if someone introduces a machine that's truly an artificial superintelligence, but until then, CSA Research predicts that demand for human and human-machine hybrid services will increase. However, they'll all just be called translation. Just as today, nobody questions whether translation memory should be part of translation. And keep in mind that if researchers actually reach artificial superintelligence, there's no guarantee that such a synthetic life form will be willing to translate or will not deliberately mess with humanity. So even then, human expertise will be needed. So if you're worried, here are some steps you can take as individuals. First, don't panic. Be skeptical about gloom and doom tech press coverage, including statement from experts that predicts the end of translation and interpreting. We don't see the evidence for that. Remember that you've heard these same voices with every generation of machine translation saying the same thing, and yet you're still here. Next, be realistic. Gen AI is going to change some of what you do. Some things you do will disappear, but it will also create new work that you've never seen before. Consider, for example, that the job of prompt engineer wasn't heard of just 6 months ago, and now companies in the US are paying salaries of up to $300,000 per year for people who can do this job. And remember that Gen AI is no substitute for your expertise. We've heard of some big businesses that have fired their localization teams and are sending everything to Gen AI. These companies will fail because Gen AI is not ready for these tasks, and it may never be. So even if things look dark, now look for new opportunities. And remember that Gen AI can make you more efficient. We started predicting already in 2016 that MT and other technologies would enable you as language professionals to do more by assisting you. This doesn't change with the introduction of Gen AI. If anything, it makes it more true because it's going to make these resources more valuable to you. You'll be able to focus more on the things that make you intelligent and that contribute. In this future, you will do more, but you'll be doing more with content that's worth more, as the rest that doesn't need your attention becomes cheaper and companies will invest more. And I'm just about out of time. I'll just say with LSPs, much of the same applies. First, Gen AI is not going to replace your services, but it will change them. Gen AI provides you with a rare opportunity to shift your focus to the needs of your clients and less on the means of production. If you use this to make this shift, you're going to be seen as more valuable. Also, make sure you understand the technology and have answers for clients and prospect questions, especially if they think that they can replace you. And finally, do not abandon any existing MT efforts you may have. MT providers are going to make improvements, and I think they're actually going to deliver better services than Gen AI for LSPs and their clients. We're already seeing the improvements coming. So one last word of advice: play with Gen AI, spend time with it, experiment with it, and learn what it can do for you. Learn what it cannot do and figure out where you fit with it. Get comfortable with it because it's here to stay. As we wrap up, perhaps you came into this presentation thinking that AI would be like this image from Albrecht Dürer of death riding out upon the land and crushing everything before it. But I hope you can see it as a different story now, and that perhaps for you it may be more like this image, also from Dürer, in which an angel is able to defeat a dragon. Perhaps you can use AI to drive your career forward and emerge stronger than ever. And with that, I would like to turn it over to all of you for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lommel. It was really good presentation. We do have a question. I just want to make some comments while listening to you and reading the presentation. I was remember that we here in the company, we try a lot with ChatGPT. Of course, it's the most known generative AI, and we actually are using this to help us, like when we create a text that is too long and we need to summarize, and we just
Perfect
put it there. Yeah, and it helps a lot. Of course, we have to check, we have to read after it, but it saves a lot of time just to, because sometimes we have a text like 1,500 words, we need like 700 or 600. We need to summarize it, and it works perfectly, and it's really good. I would pass to the questions here. It's from Andrea Souza. The first one is, considering the adaptation big TMS systems may need to do to incorporate generative AI functions fully, is there an estimate of the period, like time frame, for them to start enabling such functionalities?
That's difficult to answer. So what I can say is that all of the TMS providers I know of are actively working on some of these areas. Because they consider this a matter of competitive advantage, they don't disclose typically what they're doing exactly, or what their time frames are. One company, Phrase, which used to be called MemSource, has already started launching some of these features. They're relatively basic, but I expect to see a lot more. So I would say within the next 6 months, you should start to see more and more of these. But as far as the bigger need to completely re-engineer structures of things like translation memory and those kinds of resources, that's going to be a longer term thing.
Yeah.
I'd say probably at least a year before we really see those things happening. Although maybe somebody will come up with some clever way to work around the limitations and get those advantages. We're certainly seeing people coming up with things I never dreamed of.
Yeah, the technology is getting, it's faster, more and more faster every year. One of the TMSs that they incorporated ChatGPT 3.5, but it's not like in the TMS per se, it's more in the cat tool. I think it was Bureau Works, their cat tool and TMS integrate. They have integrated ChatGPT 3.5.
Okay.
Let's see here. Andrea made another one. What are the legal restrictions considering sharing clients' data by including such excerpts from clients' documents in ChatGPT? How can an LSP protect its clients' data considering using ChatGPT?
Okay, that's a very good question. I would not send any client data to a generative AI system unless you, as an LSP or an LSP on behalf of clients, or if you're a freelancer, your LSP has a specific agreement with the provider of the Gen AI system. And that's because the default terms of service for all of these systems now pretty much say, we can take your data and use it to improve the system. Now, there are ways to opt out, but I would be very careful. And one area that I didn't really discuss because it's not a technology limitation per se, but I think it's very important to keep in mind, is as you examine these services, read the terms and services very, very carefully. There's a lot of reason for concern. One lawyer who I follow online pointed out that basically if something goes wrong and ChatGPT or one of these services gives you something wrong, like as a translation, and it causes harm, you're responsible. They have no responsibility. So I would be very careful about relying on it anywhere where there could be harm or where there's proprietary data that you don't want out there. So you have to be very, very careful in this area.
Yeah, it's still it's blur, right? It's not very you don't have a line in the what is related to copyright, or what is, how can I say that, the line, it's still not seen in ways of breaching, and it's not very, okay, it's not very, it's still a blur.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd agree. Things are going to change. Where I would be very leery right now, for instance, would be in translating a lot of transmitting a lot of translation memory data, or these kinds of things, because you don't know for sure what's going to happen. So you're right, it is blurry. You need to be very careful and consider these things and err on the side of caution right now.
Yeah.
But if there's something that's non-confidential, go ahead and try it out. Gaining experience is important.
And one of the things that you said in the end, it's get comfortable, because it's not going to go away. It's just going to improve it, and will be incorporated in our daily tasks and in everything in our lives. So we really need to embrace it and not be afraid of. And I think you did a great job to passing this message for us. And if
Well, one thought as you said that is think of it again being like autocorrect. Sometimes it gets things wrong, but think how much time you save because autocorrect fixes your spelling mistakes and other things.
Exactly. And I think we have no more questions here. Celia, do you have any?
No, I just heard that Google's Bard has a disclaimer about information security and personal data protection. So I wonder, would maybe an anonymization tool help for translators that would like to prompt a text?
Yes, that's a good workaround in some cases. And actually, this will sound strange, but I know of at least one company that has used ChatGPT to help train its own data anonymization services. I can't go into any details, but it's interesting some of the things that can be done.
Yeah,
and
there are
sorry.
There are probably a lot of things that we don't know yet, but are going to be very useful in the near future, I guess.
Yeah, I really believe that we have a lot, so much things to come for us to be like, to us to be aware of, because there are a lot of these developments that are made like in-house, and then they popped out. There is one last question from Henrique. Do you think
It's a really interesting one.
Okay. Do you think less mature buyers or tech-based companies, for example, will be among the first ones to adopt Gen AI for translations or even content creation?
That's a very, very interesting observation. So what we see is many of the mature buyers have very established processes that are very, very efficient, and they can't easily change them. And so they aren't going to go down this route because doing so would harm them. They're already using neural MT and they have very optimized processes. But the less mature buyers and LSPs as well, I think, have an opportunity here to use Gen AI to help drive their maturity and push them along faster than they would have gone otherwise, because they're going to gain access to the kinds of technological capabilities that previously would have been outside of their reach. But now with a library of careful prompts, they'll be able to do things that would have cost them a lot in the past. So I actually think that this is going to help to drive overall industry maturity. And we'll see some of the early adopters being ones that don't have a legacy of technology and process that they have to live with.
Great. Thank you, Henrique. So, there's no more questions, I think. Oh, and Thank you very much, Dr. Lommel. It was really good to have you. It was a great presentation. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Tachi, do you have a message? Just to finish, before finish, I would like to invite you all again to our first international conference. It will be in August 25th and 26th of August in São Paulo. Let's come together. Let's join us for these 2 days of knowledge networking. It will be great to have this first one. It would be historical. And we already have some panelists confirmed. We have a workshop from Renato on the Friday afternoon. So if you have any questions, any doubts, anything, just let me know. Reach us from the board, Celia, Tachi, and Rafael and Daniel as well, and we'll be glad to answer it. So of course, we still have our call for papers open. So if you don't have the link, please tell us, and we'll we'll share the link with you so you can propose any topics, any subjects, anything that you want us to address there, any panelists. So please come together with us in this. That would be a 2 great days in São Paulo. Thank you very much, all.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much, Dr. Lommel. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.